All right, the spiritual ego is what I've decided to speak about this week. And I tell you, every time I say that I'm going to pick a really taboo subject, I think I've found one that is even greater. And I must say that I have felt personally attacked in practically every part of the conversation that I'm about to have with you. So I think that that's what makes it such a beautiful conversation is that, I mean, essentially we all have egos. And if you're on a spiritual journey, if you're wondering if you have a spiritual ego, then the answer is probably yes. And I certainly have one. And I think it is expressed really powerfully at certain points in my life. So I think it's really important that we understand that we're not going to be coming from a point of criticism or a point of who's got what, and just a point of what we can identify in ourselves and what we can make more holistic in our own process of our interaction with whatever we perceive as the divine. As a beginning caveat, I would just like to mention that I don't necessarily believe that there is actually a separate ego that is spiritual. Ego is ego, but if you were to look at the most simplistic form of ego or the core understanding that we try and have on a conceptual level, we know that what ego is it's the mental side of things. It is the mind side of things that identifies. And, you know, this is definitely not going to be a spiritual lesson, but just so that we're all on the same page, if you kind of get the idea that before you even decide what your name is, before you take any form of ownership of things, when you're born into this world, the I, being you, already definitely exists. But the I itself hasn't completed. It's not I am this, I am, it's just the I. So we're just going to call that the consciousness. And a very easy way of looking at this whole conversation is that anything that begins to identify, like the mind identifies, knows in its own way that it's temporary. And that's a really important point to realize. So it's fair to say that pretty much everybody has an ego. It's a temporary aspect of us, and knowing it's temporary attempts to identify or to try and, you know, if I could be playful, because none of this is important. This is just like an opening thought. It's almost like something knows it's temporary, and therefore the more it can identify and relate to something and prove that it is in existence, the more calm it can be. But mostly it's just the mental aspect of identification. And of course, in identifying, you know, it's the absolute incredible subject about, I'm going to mention paradox once or twice tonight. And a lot of people think it's a very fancy term, but personally, I find that I cannot look at true spirituality without paradox. To me, it is only my linear mind or my simplistic A to B mind that doesn't understand that truth is not actually A or B, that often it is A and B simultaneously. So let me give you a very simple example of that, because it's going to be quite important in the conversation we're going to have. Whether this is true or not, this would be an example of the paradox. I think I am Nathan. I certainly feel like Nathan. I have a lot of stories about Nathan that I've constructed since I started adding to this I. And I certainly am experiencing myself as separate. I am experiencing myself as an individual. And although there is all this reality around me, I can experience reality from this particular point of view. So therefore, I'm Nathan. But simultaneously, which is at the same time, now this doesn't almost make sense to the human mind unless you've had a transcendental experience. I also perceive myself as God. I also perceive myself as all things. And in doing that, the paradox would be that I can only experience myself as Nathan, or I can experience myself as all things, but I cannot experience it simultaneously. So therein lies a paradox. And you'll see a little bit later why that becomes interesting. So if you were to kind of assume that the ego loves to identify, and it builds stories and it builds dramas, and we all know a little bit about the ego in our own way. I want to pose to us, before we go down this little bit of a triggering subject to identify how it does it, I want us to consider that most of the path that leads you to spirituality is usually a path of suffering, is usually a part of over-identification. Someone broke my car, or that was my this, or violated in this way. And there's a very strong identification with the series of events that actually happen. And what's really interesting is if you consider the fact that most of the process to become spiritual is some form of, whether you're cognitively aware of the fact that you're doing it or not, it's some form of ego dissolution. So in other words, you keep realizing, oh, I'm taking this too seriously, and you shift. And, oh, I'm taking this too seriously, and you shift. And what's so beautiful, even if you're not sure what I just said, the conversation just begins with this: could we entertain that the most powerful, cunning, absolutely snide, manipulative, and intelligent version of the ego is the spiritual ego? And the reason for that is, if you have reached some point where you are already having a narrative for the existence of the ego, it's kind of like that he knows that you're in the room and you know that he is. And we've been playful, right? This is a archetype. This is, don't take me too seriously. Trust me, I've only got a few marbles upstairs. But it's like you start using words and conversations about ego, and you start talking about the presence of ego. And this is not great for something that's trying to prove that it exists, which is temporary. So the really ironic thing is that when we start to identify the ego and we develop a whole spiritual, let's call it, narrative around it, that very often, if you could give this archetype now, I want you to imagine this ego that is worked behind the scenes, who knows, thousands of years for your existence, and maybe only a few years, who knows, maybe you live once, it doesn't matter. But this ego has worked behind the scenes, and he's got you to really buy into the story. And now it's almost not good for this archetype, if you could imagine it. He's starting to talk about that he doesn't really exist and that he's not that important. And so if we could imagine this archetype is under threat, and he pulls out the absolute big guns, which is a fascinating thing. And this conversation is going to be about how can we identify how that spiritual ego is manifesting within us. So before we start that was quite intellectual. That was very in the headspace. I just want to talk a little bit about my own experience. I mean, I've always thought that something was really strange about the way that people behave once they become spiritual. Of course, I thought I was exempt from the whole thing, and I sure wasn't. If anything, I would say that I was a super archetype of this, and still am, and still will be. Let's just be clear. But I've always noticed, like, I grew up in such a spiritual environment, and I don't just mean my family. I mean, I knew a lot of spiritual groups, and I was exposed to a lot of different ways of thinking. And it always fascinated me, even as a young child, how seriously these people took themselves. That was the first thing that I found really interesting. And the other thing that I noticed, especially around the people that, let's call it in my I wouldn't even just say family, but my immediate circles, a couple of things started to bug me before I was even old enough to know what was going on. But like as a teenager, people that became highly spiritual, I eventually would avoid, because they would be full of opinions, which actually doesn't really make any sense. But oh my goodness, you couldn't just tell them that you are having a shitty day, or like, and I noticed this as a teenager, like it was literally like you were then told what you were doing wrong, or have you tried this, have you considered this concept, and solution upon solution. And to be quite honest, in my personal experience, I felt quite unsafe. And even to the degree where I would say that I can think of even family members where I felt it difficult to even want to talk to them. And I even rebelled a little bit. Eventually, I think, so that was just my personal experience. And then what started to really bug me in my late teen years was this fact that all these spiritual gurus and people that I had met or experienced or read books of, because I consumed books at a furious rate when I was in my teens. And what fascinated me was, if each of these people are so transcendentally plugged in, or if they've broken through this veneer of this of reality, of some greater, whatever you want to call it. I mean, this word we use is enlightenment, which is a very interesting word. Then why is it that they are so separate from one another? And I mean, I playfully said many times over the last 2 decades that if you were to put all the enlightened people that you know in a room, that they could not agree on the color of shot. And not even in a nice way, not in an enlightened way of, oh, you perceive it as blue. Oh, okay. How wonderful is it that God allows you to perceive him in this way? No, not in that way. In a way like, no, it's green, it's blue, it's green, it's blue, it's green, it's blue. And we know this is a fact, right? This is a little bit of a commentary on reality. But how do we know this is a fact? Well, I mean, drive down the road and you will see hundreds of spiritual organizations and churches and inner city. And these guys literally have nothing good to say about each other. They are not supportive of each other in any way. And generally, if you ask your guru, your shaman, your coach, your psychologist, have you heard of this person? This is almost always the response. Yeah, I've heard of him. Yeah, kind of. Yeah, like almost like, what the fuck is the problem? And I've tried this with a lot of people. I'll just randomly pick someone that I find so interesting. And the best thing is pick someone who is in a particular field. Do you know what I mean? So like if someone works with psychedelics or if someone works with psychology, or if someone's a specialist on trauma, go and ask that person about another person who is also broken through in that area. It's incredible. There's always this like, never like, oh, it's so amazing that there are other people out there that are doing this magnificent work and they have such a different way of doing it, but their people seem to have realizations. So this is like a bit of a personal narrative of like, this has been bugging me for a very long time. And then the most recent part of this would be that I started to have a strange feeling that the awakening that we supposedly are experiencing, that the whole world is talking about, that people can't shut up about when they're part of it, is a false awakening. That was what my gut was telling me. And that's a very awkward conversation. Luckily, I am at a point now where I'm starting to see it paradoxically that the false awakening becomes an awakening. Kind of like, until you know what you don't have, you can't experience what you have. Kind of like the paradox, until you get lost, you cannot find your way back and know what it is and where you were in the first place. So I think in some ways there is awakening in hand. But I would like to talk into at the end, very controversially, why I believe that what people are experiencing is not an awakening. So that, that opens up quite a conversation. It opens up quite a conversation for us. So there are many levels to this. And the first thing, as I said, is mostly I have experience of these people. I would playfully like to say that there tends to be 3 levels that I can tell of the spiritual ego. And I don't want you to take this too seriously, but I want you to just use this as a map as we go along. The first spiritual level of ego that I've noticed, now really guys, I have nothing to go on here. I watched a few things earlier to see if it would be helpful and really didn't. I'm just going to go on my perception, is what I would call the novice, right? Now, what the novice to me would be, it would be where a large portion of the world and a large portion of the people that I know are experiencing spirituality. And this is how this archetype works. This person has been in an extremely difficult situation or has literally transcended something unbelievable. They are the hero of the journey. They've gone searching the hero's call. They went on the hero's journey. They seeded the call. They went into the depths and they have their first victory. And with that first victory, whether it's a breakthrough in some pranic healing, breathing, some yoga position where the kundalini rises for the first time, whether they're on some psychedelic and for the first time, the frontal lobe recedes just long enough that they lose identity, and they get the paradox of all things. Doesn't matter what the breakthrough is, but this person has a genuine breakthrough into greater reality. They get to beyond belief. Up until then, so the novice is quite, to me, is quite an impressive individual, because up until then, they pretty much have books and videos and kind of like, they hope it's true. They have like this, and up until that moment, they have some sort of a breakthrough that is so transcendental or divine or experiential. In other words, they get to heal something and they experience power for the first time. Now, the novice is a very, very interesting person, because that is where I feel our awakening is sitting. Because what happens in the novice is something has definitely happened. They've had the experience. The divine is definitely giving them some sort of expression, or if you could put it in a different word, the I that they already am has revealed themselves to them. So that's an interesting stage. But if you to look at how we began this talk, you remember that I mentioned that the ego is mentally based. I mean, your mind is temporary. Mind as in the thought mind. And what's interesting about that is the ego feels the need to accumulate information. The ego is constantly improving you, constantly improving you. Now, this is why I had to begin. If you wondered, God, why did he start with paradox? So conceptual. I don't know how to tackle this without paradox. So I am not saying at any stage that one thing is wrong and one thing is right. For instance, I am saying that the spiritual ego constantly feels like it needs to enhance itself. It constantly is on a journey of, I am not enough now, and I will be enough if I just do this thing. And if we don't use this archetype, then I can't speak into it, and you cannot identify if it is outplaying in you the way it's outplaying in me. That does not mean that you should not improve yourself. That does not mean that you should not get information, right? And I need you to be mature about the way that you choose to accept what it is I'm saying. Otherwise, I'm literally going to have to dance around the subject for hours, and we wish to do this very quickly and concisely. So I am saying that the ego likes to accumulate information. I want you to consider something. We're going to pause here. I mean, just so that you're not confused, we're talking about to me, there seems to be 3 stages to the ego, the spiritual ego, and we are on the novice level. And I want to pause there for a second. If you consider sacred texts, right, and what I mean is deep ancient knowledge, doesn't matter what religion, doesn't matter what area, there is this thing right from Vedic, right from Mahayana Buddhism, right. Oh, good. Pretty much everywhere, actually, even agnostic Christianity, there's this idea, okay? And the idea is that true reality or true God, whatever you want to call it, can never be understood, can never be explained. And this is right across religion, right? It can never, ever be conceptualized. It can never be written down. Some religions go as far as, like in Hebrew, like they'll talk about, if you know the word of God, you carry so much power that you can literally manipulate reality. That's in like the Kabbalah, right? What the Kabbalah is about is if you actually know the true words of something. It's quite a simplistic example of what it's about, but you get the feel for this. So right at the core of wisdom is this idea of spirituality is only experiential. I want you to just sit with that for a second. It's only experiential. It can only be experienced. Now, if this is true, if this is a possibility, right, I want you to think about love. Think about love, right? If I write the word down, love, and I ask you, do you know what that is? You'll be like, yes. And then you ask me, and I'll be like, yes. Because we've got a word, and we both think we know what that word means. But if you're very honest, like, that tells us absolutely nothing. There are infinite, myriad expressions vibrationally of love. Every time I think I've experienced cosmic love, I come back later and I feel like, wow, I haven't even glimpsed it. So what am I saying here? We have this ancient wisdom up until almost a century ago, that no matter where you were, whether you were sitting with the Mahāyanas, whether you were with the Zen Buddhists, whether you were with, right into, it even shows up in the Arabic teachings, etc. So what's this idea of that God cannot be capsulated? He can only be experienced, and that the teachings, even Buddhism, if you look at most forms of Buddhism, right, there is absolutely no doctrine. There is this idea that the conversation will point you to the intangible essence. Okay, so what does this have to do with this conversation? It is only in the modern world that we've come across this idea that the more information we have, the more enlightened we are. All that has happened is that we have become completely possessed by our frontal lobes. And we have this idea, and think about what relevance this has to this possible false awakening, which I do believe is a very powerful thing still. And I did mention it is an awakening, but it is an earlier infantile stage than we realize. So I want you to picture this idea, right, is that we now have this idea that if you accumulate information, if you do this, you do that, you read this book, oh, yeah, but I know these laws, I know those laws, I know this, I did that course, I did this, I did this. And I don't want you to follow this conversation as some external experience. I want you to personalize it for yourself. Do I feel more spiritually secure when I accumulate information? I do. And it's this consumption that gives me this, almost this feeling that I am getting somewhere, as if the I could ever be improved on, as if the eternal awareness and consciousness within you can ever be more than what it already is. So there's the stage now that we speak of, and this novice has this experience, stage 1 of this ego. And what happens now is they just assume that, well, it's a given that this is going to be part of their lives. And in a modern information world where we need very little wisdom, we start accumulating incredible amounts of information. Do you know what the average person on earth, in the high 1% of spiritual people, think enlightenment is? They think it is to know a lot of information that other people don't know, and therefore they're enlightened. That is what people think. They use terms like woke, and I've finally woken up to what's really going on here. They have a different version of reality. That's all that's happened. And it's information, it's mentally based. And you know how it knows it has nothing to do with enlightenment? Because if they were all enlightened with this new level of information that they're so woke about, they would agree with each other. But here's the joke. If you to take 100 of the most enlightened woke people you know, and you were to bring up one subject at a time, almost to be provocative, and you were to say vaccines, and then they'd be like, oh, rah, rah, rah. And then you were to bring up the next subject and the next subject, you notice that they run from the one side of the fence to the next side of the fence. So this is definitely not some absolute intelligence, the way that we're selling it, of some agenda that the stupid sheeple can't see. That's essentially what we have, the big veneer of people that are stuck in that. And that's what I call now the novice. He's had a spiritual experience. He's decided that is what is it, what it's all about, starts accumulating information and moves into the mental side of the whole thing. And is constantly comparing information, concepts, cognitive ideas and thoughts. These people get in arguments all the time. They will argue about the colors of chakras. They will get in long, intense debates on the internet about things that actually cannot be explained. I mean, here's an example. We actually don't even know if we have chakras. That's the truth. You know what we do know? That for thousands of years, people have been talking about an archetypal, we're not sure, or actual physical system that makes so much sense that if you study it for 20 years and you look at the initiations of each thing and you look at the emotions of each thing, it is an incredible way to unlock higher knowledge. But we actually don't even know if you physically have a chakra. Because even including myself, most people I know that can see energy fields don't see chakras. So I'm using a very provocative example here. To watch people sit and argue about chakras. It's quite fascinating. Only the spiritual ego could possibly get into an argument of unquantifiable reality. And it's incredible because it constantly it has this need to assert itself and to prove that it has dominance. And it lies, if you want to know, because I definitely get stuck in this, it lies in what we call concepts. A concept is not a real thing. A concept has nothing to do with the divine expression, with the true Om of all of reality. A concept has nothing to do with that. A concept is a word that you put in the sky that tries to point towards something, like love can never, ever, ever create the tangible essence of love itself, whatever love actually is. I mean, is it really the basement fabric reality of what is behind all things? And then we have that word. So that's that archetype. And this archetype can be quite interesting because this archetype or the stage tends to be quite volatile and very excitable. Unfortunately, because of the fact that this novice enlightenment, and guys, this is playful, novice enlightenment, I honestly don't even know what enlightenment means. What happens very often is they hit a depression, and they hit a very heavy depression. And what that depression is based on is that there is no cure for life, and there is almost this feeling of, I've cracked the code now and everything's going to be absolutely okay. And then the depression hits. And what really, really freaks the person out is because they have identified with what the ego is telling them is their spiritual path, they keep consuming information, and it doesn't help. So that's that archetype. And I just want to make a sidebar note there. I want you to consider that we have a history, we think, right? It appears so, of people that every couple of eons, I mean, some eons like 300 BC, there were within 100 or 200 years, 4 or 5 enlightened people, from Buddha to, I can't even think of their names right now. So my point is that it's very rare, but there is a history of beings that appear to have become fully enlightened. And I want you to consider how much information they had available to them. Just for a second, I want you to ask you, how much information do you think these men had available to them? I can tell you now, they had hardly any information available to them. In actual fact, if you consider it very carefully, you will actually realize that sometimes, if you know the story of the origins of certain versions of Zen and stuff, sometimes they were forced to actually, where they didn't want to actually write down what it is they thought was going on. And a lot of doctrines have kind of been born like that. And if you think very carefully, you realize that even some of the guys we think were enlightened didn't write down any of the stuff that we are saying about them. It's quite fascinating. So why is this important? Just to anchor for a second, to realize these guys that have broken through, you know what they had? They had prayer, they had awareness, they had dedication, they had unwielding, rapturous, like enchantment, to be absolutely, like, their whole lives were just about looking behind the I am something to the I, and what that I is to them. So why this is important is I want us to consider that the culminating, actually the accumulation of information can actually be a mighty deterrent. And if we really are on the path, I want us to consider, for instance, let me take the Tao. Okay, let's use the Tao, because I never talk about the Tao. If you were to read the teachings of the Tao, and you just sat down and you told yourself, this truly is the word of the all-seeing one, try it and read 2 pages of it. I tell you, actually have a transcending experience. But the problem is, instead of working that and allowing it to lead you to what it is you need to do, this ego is expressing in, I will improve, I need more information, I think I understand this page. And basically it's almost like It's an absolute consumption. So that would be our first archetype. And the second archetype gets very interesting. It's what I call the yogi stage. Now, what the yogi stage of the ego is what's happened here is this person has found in all their searching a very particular school of thought, or let's call it practice, okay, which is why I've used the word yogi, right? Because if you look at what yoga is, it means work, and it's a specific brand of spiritual work. So the yogi, what would happen is, let's say it's yoga. Person finds some form of enlightenment through yoga, let's say through psychedelics, let's say through, there's so many things, breath work, some religion, some temple, and this person now is in a very particular practice, and by now in a very particular way of thinking. Now this person becomes absolutely fascinating because, first of all, because it has been the way that this person has been able to unlock their way to feel better, because I'm not even going to say their enlightenment. They found a way through the stuff that life is making a bit more sense to them. And quite honestly, like, they're happy. They feel love. They think, wow, this must be a transcendent state of reality, even though we actually have no idea how high the state can actually get. That would be the wonderful side, is that they're living a life that's okay for them. But what would the egoic side of it is that, well, they are convinced that it's now one size fits all. They are the worst persons to have conversations with. Absolute worst, because everything is through that filter. Yeah, but have you tried psychedelics? I always use the archetype here when I was preparing this talk. I can't really draw, but I wrote Joe Rogan in a bubble because I love the meme. Someone will be like, wow, bro, have you ever seen a UFO? And you'll be like, no, bro, but have you tried DMT? And then someone else will be like, Joe, what do you think about trauma? And you'll be like, wow, it's hectic, bro. Have you tried DMT? And to me, that is like a really funny archetype of what these people can be like. And because they're archetypes, guys, it's just to trigger something. So what this archetype is they're very sure that there is a particular way. And therefore, they believe there are very particular keys to the kingdom, which gives them very often some form of intellectual superiority, of course, and very often like a bit of an element of segregation. And what's fascinating about people in the yogi stage is they very often put themselves in pockets of society that are separate from other people, which is absolutely fascinating. I was watching such a beautiful movie, whatever, a little while ago on Piang, I think, in Thailand. And I can't actually remember what this area is called, but there's a little area that is known as like the yoga capital, almost like of the world at the moment, where all the enlightened yogis, or not yogis, people specifically for yoga go. And I was just fascinated at these stories and whatever. You know what was incredible? This guy arrives, he's like really into his yoga, and he meets his tour guide, and such an intelligent young lady. And she basically opens up to him and says, look, I've got to be honest with you, we cannot handle the people that come here to do yoga. She says, like, we cannot even stomach them. Like, we've got to the point where we have to just smile and be like, they're welcome, enlightened ones. And he asks her, and then he asks her if he can record it. And she basically says, oh my God, these are the most narcissistic, self-absorbed, like, and that's her perception of this. And then what he shares in his movie, because it's quite a long thing about his journey, was he then started watching people. And it's fascinating because she, being a Buddhist, she had a very simple explanation when he asked, but, you know, what makes you say that? And she said, well, as an example, you see that temple over there where they're all going to do yoga. She says, those are the guys that are in the advanced this and this. She said, look at the beach that they're walking across. And they're all walking across a beach which had plastic, which would have, 10 pieces of plastic would have been so easy to pick up. And in her perception of whatever she thought enlightenment was, she could not believe that these people were there as the vulnerable ones, and venerable, sorry, that's the word. Some of them had titles and robes, and And like, if you try to ask them if they were to be involved in any of the solutions of the society or the island, or these people were not interested, because in some way they were removed. And that's where this yogi thing can be dangerous. Where I think it could be powerful is if you can accept that that was the path for you, that worked for you, and you do not have the same trauma, physical background, cosmological, archaeological. You don't have the same background as that other person. You have not had the same set of oppressors, to be honest. So yeah, that would be that stage. Then the third stage, as we build this playful archetype of how many levels to this almost how scary we're making this spiritual ego, is the guru stage. Oh my God, that's my favorite. First of all, most gurus, right, are self-appointed. So they are self-proclaimed. Think about that for a second. Think about it. Like literally, like no matter who it is, I want you to just think about it. It's not that one guy went, you know, my name is Krishnamurti, and I want to let you all know that the third golden Buddha from the second sun has just arrived. He's been born in San Francisco, which they used to do for hundreds of years. And his name is Bob. And then Bob comes into the limelight and he goes, yes, yes, it's true, it's true. Most gurus are self-proclaimed, first of all. And the guru complex is something that is extraordinary, because essentially, to be a guru, there's quite a few things that have to happen. The first thing is a person has to be extremely intelligent. Fact, person has to be extremely intelligent. The second thing is a person has to have a way of explaining through language things that most people cannot, and finding a way to unify in language things that are generally not unifiable. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but one can certainly imagine how powerful the ego would get at that point. So instead of demonizing this, I want us to just consider that what I'm actually saying here is that the further you go, and even this is a joke because there's nowhere to go, this is my ego speaking, that you're advancing to, I'm saying there's no such thing, that the ego becomes more and more tricky the more you think you've got this whole thing sorted out. So it's fascinating. So that, yeah, we've built those kind of those little archetypes, for the lack of a better word. And I want us to get personal now. I want us to consider something. We keep talking about this paradox. I want to give you the ultimate paradox about the spiritual ego. Remember, paradox, kind of the way we're using it, is something that appears that two things are in contradiction or on the opposite sides of truth, but are simultaneously true, right? So here's one. How much of healing is self-obsession? At what point does your spiritual journey of me, I, my story, my emergence, my greatness, my path, oh, my victories, at what point does that become completely fucking narcissistic? At what point? I don't know. There's definitely a point. And I'm not the first person to speak about this. I've been thinking all day where the point lies, and I don't know, but I know that I've crossed it. I can tell you that now, and even recently, because I've been on this magnificent journey of trying to heal some really, really serious problems. But I want us to just consider that it's the most fascinating thing. We recently in a temple at the end of a beautiful quest, we had all these people that hearts and minds were so wide open. We sat and we all joined hands. And in that moment where we all joined hands and I closed my eyes, I knew instantly that each one of these people had a very specific set of problems and a very specific set of proclivities and fears and strengths. And somehow only when we all joined hands in that moment did their problems not actually seem nonsensical. They made sense for the first time. It's as though those problems were safe in context with each other. So what I'm trying to express is that often our neuroses actually don't make sense because we are trying to understand ourselves as a completely separate entity, as a completely unique individual that has nothing to do with the things that are going on around us, which I think why the paradox is important. There is definitely an element of power in it, because to actually go, I am taking ownership for this. I am taking ownership for the part that I bring into the world, into this co-creation of however that works. I think that's beautiful. But trying to understand yourself without understanding the people around you, without understanding your community, without understanding the world, well, I think that's a path to madness. If I'm rambling, let me try and give you an example. Okay, I want to try and give you an example. Let's say I have mental problems and I really battle with reality. They've told me that I'm trying to think, let's call it borderline personality, or someone's told me I'm schizophrenic, or there's so many different things. Let's say you have a serious mental problem. And what your problem is essentially that you battle, you get scared sometimes because reality doesn't seem, you know, some people, I'm very blessed to never had it, but some people, they have hallucinations and just normally, and they're scared. So let's try and isolate that person, right? Now, hundreds of years ago and for thousands of years, documented in hundreds of books, spoken about all around the world, this is not my idea, those people would be embraced as having something quite special to bring across, right? And let's say this person was kept calm and they felt safe within the environment because they were in nature and in their tribe. And let's say that this person began to understand that the reason they are experiencing reality differently is so that they could teach something differently, or tell a different story, or give a different version to what everybody else has. So now what we have is a person in a tribe having an experience that nowadays would be considered something absolutely terrifying, because individually, on their own, that person, especially now that we are in a world of comparison, which is the ego's favorite game, that person is very afraid. And if that person tries to solve themselves in a line of comparison, but mostly as in me, that person just goes down a spiral that is never ending. But for that person to find meaning, if you now bring in that person's tribe, and imagine now this person, let's even make it modern time. This person's tribe is so supportive and it has elders in the tribe. This could even be people in a city. I use those words. And they point out to this person that this person has incredible gifts. Like, wow, you have an amazing way of understanding people's emotions. Do you feel where I'm going with this? Now, how do you think this person deals with their problem once they understand that their problem is also a solution to certain things, that what they lose in one area, they bring into another area? So if this is a fact, and if there's any power in what I'm expressing, I'm actually saying that very many of your problems will not have relevance or context without those around you, the community, the tribe that you pick, etc. So we come back to the question, at what point does your healing journey become narcissistic? Because I can tell you now, and I mean this when I say including myself, I became self-obsessed. Because I mean, now the ego is running in the background, the story that you're not enough, you are not the eternal, all-pervading essence that you began as, that you will end as, that you always will be, that can never improve, never be broken down, never lost. You are the innocence of all things that can never be changed. No, that's not what the ego is telling us. The ego is telling us, look, you're suffering, you're uncomfortable, come and do these things. And it certainly does, there certainly is a lot to it. It's not all ego, because I mean, if you're doing something and it's making you uncomfortable and it's not giving you victories, you can change those victories. So this is not against all forms of self-improvement. And I'm so glad I went on my journey. But at what point, and you can only ask yourself in this meditation, at what point am I at the point where I can now admit that with my proclivities, I am at the point where I am most powerful now, and I am now moving into self-obsession. An example is that some of us will always carry certain wounds, certain thoughts. I'm not saying that we express them in behaviors. I'm not saying that we stay in a state of unsafety. But I mean, for instance, if you've ever watched the movie, it's one of my absolute favorites, called Beasts of No Nation. And it's about how children become child soldiers and eventually generals in an army. And it's one of my absolute favorite movies, because I do not believe in intrinsic evil. I do not believe in evil that is separate from us. So why this conversation is so powerful to mention something so obscure is because those children in that movie, there is very little chance that that man, once he started his healing journey, was going to always feel settled when he fell asleep at night. No matter what romantic world you brought him into, malls and clean houses and safe streets, and there's a part of him that is never ever going to be the same. But now if you bring him to get self-obsessed with what his problem is, the man will go insane. But add his community in there, people that are, oh, what can we learn from this? Imagine he talks about his experiences. Imagine people understand what he's been through, and in his community, in his tribe, he could become an elder. It would be like, wow, the things this guy's been through. And the guy would also be realistic about the fact that when you take a deep wound, or when you stare suffering very, very, very deeply into the eye, understand that a part of that is going to sit with you to keep that wisdom. Because in some ways that wisdom disappears. A kind of a silly example is if you stare into a light and then you close your eyes, very often, long after, you can still see the image. I'm not talking about staying in a state of victimization. I am simply talking into the beautiful idea of the fact that your journey of self-improvement is something that I'm so proud that we've done. It's wonderful that human beings want to improve and express themselves. But at what point does it get to the point where you're just being narcissistic? I've been to retreats. I've been to a lot of courses where all these people are there to improve themselves, and all that it feels like to me, including me, are a bunch of self-absorbed assholes. That's all I see. That I just want to know, this is how it is, and God's like this with me, and I'm on a healing journey, and I don't see them helping the collective in any way. And it's a really big conversation, because I think it's not one or the other. I think it's to just have the absolute pervading awareness. And awareness is the only thing we have against ego. As long as you're aware of it, it loses its power, right? It's the reason why the spiritual ego became so strong in the first place, because you started to speak about it. And I think just being aware of that, ask yourself sometimes, like, if you are not convinced that the spiritual journey itself can lead you to become a narcissist, right? I want to give you a very personal example. So I have battled with certain areas of mental illness in my life. I'm very blessed to say that it is far more life these days. But I can tell you now, a big part of my work is I work with other people that also have experienced neurosis, not from the perspective of thinking they're broken, but often to empower them to repossess their minds and to discover kind of what gifts they've brought through. So now I want to tell you something that any neurotic knows, and I'm just going to guess that nearly every person in this room has an experience with neurosis. Now, what do you know about neurosis? If you've got too much time on your hands, it gets worse. If you think too much, it gets worse. If you don't have a purpose, the depression gets worse. If, like, literally, guys that are in the worst place with neurotics, like, which just means like mental aberrations, they tend to be so self-consumed. One of my all-time great teachers, Manly P. Hall, jokes that eventually neurosis gets so bad that you have to quit your job so that you can dedicate yourself to it 24/7. In other words, mental problems become so bad eventually that you eventually have to quit your job so that you can dedicate yourself to it. And obviously, he's being very facetious. But I want you to just consider then how, if you've ever thought of anxiety, I mean, what is worse, right? Ask yourself this. You have some huge event that's going to happen on the Monday and you're very anxious about it. Would you rather be really busy playing with your family, going to the beach, doing your job and thinking about it in the background and allow it to arrive on the Monday? Or would you like to do what we do and sit down and solve it and heal it and fix it and meditate it? And very often we open a wound even greater. And that's what I would call the whispers of the neurotic. And that to me is an example of how a wound can be opened. Only you, so I'm going to surmise what I'm saying, only you can decide whether you are scratching at a wound to the point where you are just making it bigger, or whether this is something that needs to speak. It's something that needs acknowledgement still. Only you can decide whether you have suppressed your own story to such a degree that it's fighting back, or you have slipped way past that and gone into the narcissistic realm where you have to compulsively tell your story to such a degree that you are putting a spell on yourself. As the great Krishnamurti said, perhaps the suffering is done with you and you are not yet done with the suffering. It's only you that can decide. Notice, I have no idea. I'm speaking into the inquiry of my own soul and my own ego. These are the thoughts of my own ego. I mean, my own mind about my ego and the way it expresses. So yeah, what a fascinating subject. So to bring it to a close, and I'm hoping I've just kind of stimulated certain ideas in you, and I hate lists. It's like, I hate lists. I've always complained that one of my things that I find so hysterical about YouTube or about the modern world is it's not deep unless it's in bullet point, you know. You used to have to read a good solid book to have some value on a subject, and now it would be the 5 things that make you wise. So I've decided that I'm finally going to conform to the modern world. Maybe I'll get like a whole 5 subscribers from this or something, you know, because I'm really getting with it. I'm getting consensual and to the point. So what I'm talking about is I wrote down, I spent 3 days doing this, things that I identify in myself that are versions that have once played or currently outplaying in my spiritual ego. And I wrote them down, and I'm going to go through the list very quickly for you, kind of like bullet point with a comment or two, and then I'll start bringing us to a close. So to me, this is, and I'm not going to get into the explanation, it either lands for you or it doesn't. We have different ideas, different concepts, different ideas what the spiritual path is. To me, sign 1 that I'm lost in my spiritual ego, over-intellectualizing my experience. That is number 1. I'm full of concepts, full of ideas, this levels, hierarchy, this happens here, if you just do this, it's 17, it's that, it's this frequency, there's a full-on explanation for everything. Lots of debate, constantly debating, which is ridiculous, because as soon as you move into the essence of all things, nothing can be said. So to me, that's, and I love it. I'm an intellectual. I love talking. I love ideas. But honestly, I'm getting to the point where like they're just ideas. They really are. Number 2, judging others to be more or less advanced. To me, that is like the ultimate. And it's so subtle, guys. It's so subtle. Like some people are blatant, depending where they are on those 3 levels, right? But some people, it's so blatant that it's almost like, I can't remember Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner spoke about the fact that some people far down on their spiritual path become so his word was psychotic, but he said lack of empathy, that what happens is they're so invested in their concept that if they see someone else suffering, what unconsciously goes on in their mind is, oh, they haven't sussed it out yet. They haven't unlocked it. They like absolute lack of empathy. And I have identified that in myself. Stage 3, or not stages, just third thing that I think is very interesting that we can identify the spiritual ego is when someone is very invested in dogmas, truths, and axioms. I don't think that needs explanation. It's A, and everyone must agree that it's A. It's very similar to the other one about intellectualizing, but dogma. One of my favorite stories, I think I mentioned actually in a recent talk, was all of Buddha's disciples arguing about, Dharma is kind of it's the explanation of their wisdoms and their truth. And they argued about the Dharma, and Buddha basically said, as his last thing, there is no Dharma. There is no truth. There is no up, there's no down, there's no left, there's no right. So yeah, number 4, developing a Messiah complex. That is a very interesting way that spiritual ego shows up, because essentially they're a pain in the ass. They're terrible to be around because they've got the answer for everything. They cannot hold space. When you are really, really hurting, or you are facing the deepest, darkest things of your life, you want to be heard. And the person hearing you must be able to experience or just be there with you. That's all you need, not a fucking lecture or an explanation of what you should do or what will work for you. And the way I check myself there, even when I'm coaching, is if someone asks me, I tell them. Otherwise, I'm mainly listening. I'm bouncing off. I'll say, like, this is what it sounds like. Is this what you're meaning? But I very seldom tell them, oh, you know what you should do. No. If someone wants to know what I think about something, they will tell me. And that's what I call insertion. And nowadays I can have a whole spiritual conversation and have quite a lot of thoughts on it. But just know that the person's actually just sharing with me. Shut the fuck up, Nathan. The person's just sharing with you. They don't want to know. And if they do think about this, they'll say, I really need help. I want to know what you think about that. And then the doorway's open. I think it was Oshu who spoke about the fact that a flower doesn't sit in the field, and a enlightened flower doesn't run around looking for bumblebees. That's how he put it. The flower just sits there. And if one day a little bee comes along and goes, zzz, as in, please tell me what you think, the flower's like, cool, no problem. Beautiful thought. Number 5, stuck in the ruck of trying to think positively all the time. It's a fucking cult. It's such a big cult that I made an entire talk about it, as you guys know, called the Law of Attraction Under Fire. Oh, I had a lot of fun there. I think even my spiritual ego was enjoying that. Go boy, you got quite an interesting perspective here. Yeah, just think about that for a second, jokes aside. The thinking positive cult. Paradox again. Does it help to think positively? Of course it does. Does it help when you start to realize that you are affecting your life and your creation and you cope? Of course it does. But there's nothing worse than being around someone that has decided as their dogma, as their ego, that just think, oh, bro, you got to be more positive. The guy's sharing a deep wound with you. Like, can you hold space for someone, or are you part of the think positive cult, which the ego absolutely loves because it gets to avoid all the negative issues. It just gets to focus now on love and light, and everybody else has got such heavy vibes, bro. Shoo-wee, has he not even read the Law of Attraction? So yeah, I found that in myself. A couple of more that we'll do. I mentioned trying to be a guru to people. This one's slightly different. Like literally, like this person is ready to be a guru to people. You know, and this one triggers me, right? Because I am very, very passionate about talking about subjects and things. And I think the way that I've dealt with this is like, if you've ever, some of you have ever listened to one of my talks, I never say that this is how something is. I say, let's talk about something and here's possibilities. And I really don't know how anything is. But yeah, it can be quite difficult. I had a few people in my life that were very close to me that were trying to be a guru to me, and instead of being able to hear them, I just found that I felt very unsafe. People that are convinced they have it figured out are in their spiritual ego. Spiritual righteousness, when they're lost in right and wrong. Remember, the ego is identifying. The ego is separate. So it is convinced that it's righteous. And do you know how you know if it's outplaying in you? Well, a very personal, very controversial example would be the ego absolutely believes in intrinsic evil. Absolutely. Any belief where there's them and you, and there is no more personal one than intrinsic evil. People like myself, I don't perceive intrinsic evil. I perceive that I am part of all things and that it is expressing in a myriad of ways. But people that start to decide that part of their dogma is intrinsic evil, they get to point the finger a lot. A perfect example is what's his name? See, I've forgotten his name. I need to chat to him soon again. I'm joking, but what's his name? The devil. The devil made me do it. See, I must become more familiar with it. Yeah, the devil made me do it. There's a perfect example. And a lot of these trigger me quite strongly. Very interesting one. Lacking curiosity about life. Because now you're in your brain, you've got it all figured out, you know how it works. And you've absolutely lost the curiosity of, as Eckhart Tolle says, you can sit and stare at a stone, and like after 20 minutes, he starts wondering, what is even a stone? Like, it's just a word. Like, what is this thing actually? Like, you can get lost in it, man. The Zen, most of Zen is literally observing something without deciding what it is. So I think that's interesting. Lacking humility. And we're in our last few now, and then we're going to close up. And this, to me, is probably one of the biggest ones. Compassion. If you lack compassion, then you're lost in your spiritual ego. The only way you cannot have compassion for everything and everybody is to have a story that makes them wrong. Consider that. No matter how much of an idiot someone is, or no matter how dark they are, no matter what they've done, the only way you cannot have compassion towards them is if something in your story makes them wrong. If two human beings stand in front of each other and they stare into each other's eyes and they're open, like their hearts are open, maybe they've just done a ceremony or a breathing technique, all you can experience is absolute love for the person you're seeing until maybe they click their eye a little bit in a certain way, and it reminds you of your stepdad who used to beat you like a red-headed stepchild, or whatever the story is, and now you're triggered and you don't know if you like him. You start building up the story where you don't feel that compassionate towards this guy. So just consider the compassion. And how would you know if this is outplaying in you? Do you go on rants about the world? Do you go on rants about what people are doing? And once again, that paradox always exists, because I am not saying that it is incorrect to be angered. I am not saying that. And that is why the key to this whole thing has been the paradox. You can only for yourself decide. This is how this paradox would play out. Ask yourself, am I standing for something in a way that I just feel that this thing needs to be ignited and stood for? Or am I standing for this thing because in making it wrong, I feel better about myself? There are two possibilities. And I can tell you now that sometimes I'm literally just standing up for something. And sometimes I just feel superior. And I've got to identify those two things. Neither wrong, neither right. But compassion to me is the deepest part of this conversation. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but very, very controversial one I'll finish with, because I made 20. I've gone through a few of them. You stop living your life because now you're spiritual. We'll end with such a controversial one. You bail from your life. You suddenly, like, you just want to retreat. All you want is some secluded this, or once again, feel the paradox before you jump on what I'm saying. Sometimes you will need to remove people from your lives, of course, because perhaps they have not been a healthy part of your life. And we must make lifestyle changes. And certainly when we begin to understand ourselves on a deeper level, certainly it must be understood that often we would change jobs, we would change environments, but it is very common and very recorded how often people that are in what I call playfully the novice period of their spiritual ego will suddenly decide, oh, none of this is my circus, want to remove themselves from all things, and very often will hit such a massive depression when they discover what it is that they do once they've removed all the things that they've blamed for their struggles. So that brings us to the end, and I think the most beautiful subject regarding people that are lost a little bit in their spiritual ego is when they talk about ego itself. Ego death. Bum, bum, bum. I'm so advanced, bro, that my ego died. Wow! Which is quite extraordinary, because we started this talk talking about you can either only see yourself or all things. And when you drink a plant medicine, or whether you do a sacred ritual, an area of your brain starts to switch off, and technically your ego dies. And to truly let go completely of yourself is quite scary, so that you can, on the other side, completely glimpse what it is that all things are without you. But then you have to come back. So you cannot get rid of your ego. Your ego is your interface with reality as a separate individual. So this ego death is the most hysterical way to finish. When someone tells me that they've had an ego death, I say, that's fantastic. And how is it doing now that it's growing back? That would be my answer, because hopefully it grows back slightly differently. Hopefully with whatever you saw on the other side of the curtain has brought you back a little bit less worried about the color of your new BMW. I don't know, perhaps. But the fact that you think that your ego is gone would be the ultimate level, to me, of being stuck in spiritual narcissism. So thank you for this evening. I'm going to end this recording shortly. I think not to leave it on I don't think it's a negative note. I really hope you guys understand that I don't want you to take this too seriously. I don't want you, I mean, the ego wants that. The ego wants you going, you know, I think John has such a spiritual ego problem, or I've just identified the people in my life I need to remove from my spiritual circles. You know, like, don't take this shit too seriously. But I can tell you, I found it very holistic. And sometimes I'm in the middle of a conversation, or I'm doing a spiritual practice, and I ask myself, like, what are you trying to become? You know, or are you trying to impress the person? Or are you saying this to uplift the person? And I do feel that there is value in just bringing the conversation to the table. And I hope that that's the way you take it. I hope that you realize that it's just one person's perceptions of possibilities that lie within this thing. Ash.